The Barrow, Book 2, Blackheart, by Mark Smylie. Prologue the second, beneath Therapoli Magni, capital of the Middle Kingdoms, the 9th of Ascension. Somewhere in the dark, a woman whispered. The old man, using the name Sequintus Eridane, moved gingerly down ancient stone steps. Long years had passed since he had last been down this far under the city, and every step felt like a step in the wrong direction. The dancing shadows cast by his sputtering lantern, the looming weight of the earth above him, the still dead air, all of it left him with jingled nerves and damp robes sticky with sweat as he descended into the darkness. He was relieved to finally hit a level passage and paused a moment, catching his breath. He blinked the sweat out of his eyes and took in the mortared yellow stone of the walls around him, the rough-hewn ceiling of the passage. "Ah, 3rd century stonework, from the age of legends," he thought. He ran his trembling fingers over a stone that had been carved with the seal of King Eldred, last Danyan king of Therapoli, before the coming of the Aurians over 1,000 years ago. Almost there, just a little farther. He raised his head and listened to the odd sounds of the deep earth. The air felt dull and still, the sound dampened and seeming like it came echoing from great distances. He could hear someone or someones coming down the stairs behind him, possibly someone up ahead. With a great summons gone out, though far too late as far as he was concerned, he knew he would not be the only person in these passages this day, and found that vaguely reassuring. Few things at that moment would be scarier, he thought, than to be the only living person trying to make their way through the underground levels of a city of this size and age. The buried layers of all parts of the city, one on top of the other, the cellars and sewers dug deeper and deeper, the old mortuaries and bone depositories, the cisterns and waterways that had been laid down when the city was first built by the Durians during their great palace period. A veritable maze with an actual maze. The labyrinth of Myrad the Mad, to be found somewhere deep within it, at least according to legend. He took a deep breath and began to slowly move forward, trying to remember the sequence of passages and turns. Left, right, left, 3rd right, 2nd left. The passages grew exceedingly quiet, sounds fading, and as he passed through a rusting iron gate that he did not remember, he began to wonder if he had taken a wrong turn. But then he was ducking through a low stone arch and coming up short in front of several masked and hooded figures waiting in the dark, men whose plain cloaks did not disguise the fact that they were wearing harnesses of steel. He jumped, quite startled. Sequintus did not bear upon him a mark of the nameless, but still one of the men recognized him and clears his throat. "Apologies, Magister," the man said with a short bow. Sequintus sighed and grimaced, waving his head feebly as his nerves resettled into some semblance of calmness. The man stepped to the side, still bowing, and with a grunt, Sequintus continued on his way. It was not long before he could hear voices and screams ahead of him, and eventually he emerged into a high-ceilinged antechamber. The growing light now strong enough that he was able to douse his own lantern and set it in a recessed alcove with shelves already filled with other unlit lanterns. "I rather like that lantern," he thought idly, eyeing the collection. "Though maybe that's just because I'm used to it. I shall be quite sad if someone else should take it by accident." He looked up. He could not see them, but he could sense dark presences lingering high above him, watching him from somewhere up near the ceiling. He waved absently and looked back down at the lantern. He tried to remember where he had gotten it. And was it from the sign of the Three Hammers on the Strait of the Crafts? And could not. He sighed again and turned and entered his destination. The even higher, sea-lined auditorium of the Black College was built like a theater in the round, circles of stone steps that doubled the seats rising up from a broad raised platform in the center of the room. He entered it through one of the 4 archways on the floor of the chamber, whose aisles helped divide the theater into quarters, and he could also see 4 exits towards the ceiling at the top and back of each quarter of seats that allowed egress to the upper arcade of the complex. Several great iron chandeliers hung from the coffered ceiling, ablaze with hundreds of candles like stars in the night, and 4 burning braziers ringed the central platform. Sequintus could sense more of the dark watchers circling unseen above the chandeliers. Visitors were already seated throughout the 4 quarters of the auditorium, and some clustered in several of the entrance aisles, but none of them paid his arrival much mind. They were either engrossed in conversation, whether low and whispered or shouted across the auditorium, or focused on an appetizer entertainment, a man being slowly disemboweled alive on an altar in the central platform by several masked priests. "So that's what all the screaming is about," said Quintus thought. He shrugged and turned away and started to pick his way up the nearest set of steps. Polished skulls marked with dark runes were scattered about, and by each skull sat a waiting silent ghost clothed in ash, their masks opening on black holes where their eyes should be. They seemed to be watching the sacrifice with rapt, hungry attention. He worked his way through the living and the skulls and the ghosts until he found a suitably isolated spot lying in shadow up near the chamber wall. Several spectres silently slid apart to allow him to sit, and he granted the thanks. As it had taken a great deal of walking to get here, he was very glad to have firm stone underneath him. So for some minutes he simply rested, caught his breath, glanced idly about as he let the sounds of the chamber wash over him unheeded. The auditorium reminded him of some of the classrooms in the university, but then he supposed it was probably originally a lecture hall from the Golden Age campus buildings, now long buried and forgotten by the world above, reclaimed for a new purpose. As his wind returned, he slowly got his bearings. She sat in the topmost row amongst the sacred spirits, her back against the wall, studying the nameless of the Black College from behind her black vulture head mask, her black feathered cloak drawn tightly around her, as though she was wearing a piece of living shadow. Her breathing was ragged, her wounds still deep and raw, still healing from the touch of her Lord and Master's blessed servant. It's this pain there deep within her chest, a reminder of her failures, her promises, her vows. Her eyes were narrow slits as they fell on the old man, her head tilted in surprise and calculation as she recognized him from years past. Was his presence here coincidence? Across from his place, the stone steps were occupied by the brown robes of members of the university, their folds parted now to reveal a layer of black cloth beneath. Black masks, full or half, were the norm amongst them, but he knew how the sitting would arrange itself. The 4 masked men seated at the bottom closest to the platform will be the 4 full magisters who had pledged to the Black College, the golden chains of their office on full display, and rendering their masks pure affection, as their identities were quite apparent by the regalia they wore. Behind them would come several rows of under-magisters and assistant magisters, and then the empty-looking top rows would be the handful of current students who had been inducted into the college. Individually, many of them were Nimargatia, those who had dedicated themselves directly to Nimarga, the devil, or whisperers, the devotees of Amaimon, the hell prince of intrigue and secret power. But here in these chambers they will speak and act as the full fellows of the Black College, first and foremost. The section to his right was filled mostly with more whisperers, masked men and women, many of them in aristocratic finery beneath their dark cloaks, many bearing a badge of office that marked them as being in the service of the High King, or from one of the city's merchant courts. His eyes could not help but settle on a blonde, Aurian woman in the first row of seats, wearing a half mask of long, straight white feathers. She was dressed entirely in white brocade, velvet that glittered with small bright white stones, and she stood out like a lighthouse burning brightly against the dark clothes and cloaks of those seated all around her. Lady Sigala, Ferguson Farwain and her entourage, he thought. A high priestess of Amaimon and Giti Mahamat both walks amongst us. We are blessed. A masked man sat next to her, his impressive gold chain of office glinting in the firelight. Her lover, Hugh Vorgis, Lord of the Chancery, who worked side by side with her husband. The section to his left was filled primarily with more Nimargatia, who were now associate fellows of the Black College at this point in their lives, almost all of them magicians or sorcerers, alchemists or enchanters, who had once been students of the university and full fellows at the college during their time there. Their ranks would include several officers of the city's great magical fraternities, the Hermetic Guild and the Alchemists' Guild. He felt a pang as his one-time protégé, Lay Miradun, would have once deserved a privileged seat at the fore of that section, having been cast into exile from the university, a rare honor and dishonor both. He blinked, almost imagining for a moment that he had seen Lay's face turning to look in his direction. But then the apparition was gone. The section he had found himself in was filled in its front ranks by the worshippers of Ishraha, the rebel angel, the bright king, the great general who had confronted the criminal Dyslexic, king of earth, and cast him down from his throne and into exile. Sequintus could see the back of the head of the painted prince of the Guild of Therapoli in the first row below him. The painted prince never bothered with the mask, as his tattooed skull was unmistakable. Someone had told Sequintus the man's real name once, but he couldn't remember it. One of the Sirius or Carceres lineages, or at least red, was it? But the youngest son of a minor line regardless, like so many other servants of the bright king, just one who had disappeared into the underworld of Therapoli. That they were in the front row was a bit unusual. Normally, they were the smallest in number amongst the four greatest nameless cults represented in the chamber, and were seated farther up, closer to the spot he had found himself. But no, recent events had upset the usual pecking order of the chamber, for normally the followers of Ligrit, Queen of Perversion, would have occupied that front row, and indeed filled almost this entire section, had they not all been almost entirely wiped out to a man and woman in a 3-day massacre by members of the very same guild to which the painted prince belonged. Sequintus very much suspected that someone would soon be pointing out that. As it was, the sad remnant of the cult was barely more than a couple dozen loyal deviants, pushed out of their usual front row seats by the painted prince and his fellow servants, clustered together a few rows below Sequintus, most piteously. In the rest of the section and the upper seats of his left and his right, he could see a smattering of men and women dedicated to the more obscure, nameless cults of forbidden gods. Devotees of Getima and Azazel and Balhu, Githwain the Last Worm, and Malkheb, and a few Rahabites who were pledged to obscure individual demons from the ranks of Hell's guardians and generals. As he looked around, he did not think anyone there represented the old cults of the Corn King or the King of Brass, or ancient Mael Fes, or would be counted amongst the Azharites, or followers of the Black Goat. Those were the nameless of the mountains and the wastelands and the fields, and unlikely to have adherents here in the capital city. A few of his closest neighbors, a couple of rows below him, were occasionally glancing back over their shoulders in his direction with frowns, and he realized with yet another sigh that, as usual, he had sat in the wrong section. Presumably, his proper place should have been amongst the Nimargatia on his left, as a university-educated enchanter, no longer officially part of the Black College. It's a stupid rule anyway, he thought, and he smiled and shrugged apologetically at some of the folks eyeing him. But they just shook their heads and gave him the cold shoulder. The screaming from the central platform had finally died down. One of the priests lifted up a great golden chalice filled with blood and pieces of flesh drained and cut from the sacrificial victim. He held it up for all to see and used a double-tined fork to fish out a bloody morsel, which he proceeded to eat with great relish. He walked over to the 4 magisters of the Black College with the chalice held high, and one by one, the magisters took the fork and speared a portion for themselves. As the priest continued to circle around the floor of the auditorium, offering a taste of the sacrifice to those seated in the front rows, one of the masked magisters rose up from his seat and tapped the metal-shod tip of a great staff upon the stones. "Nimarga, we beg you, be patient. We remember you." His deep, melodious voice boomed out over the quieting crowd. Even without his chain of office, he would have been recognizable by voice alone as Lord Magister Conrad Galdrum, Chair of History, Dean and Provost of the University of Therapy. "Nimarga, we beg you, be patient. We remember you," echoed his audience, Sequintus among them. But the old man spoke the words quietly in the old language of Maerberos. "Nimarga, nos tahin plegar, bid paichin, nos tahin recordamos." "Princess of Hell, we beg you, be sated. We feed you," the Lord Magister chanted, and the audience repeated his words. "Gaedam dehun ferein, nos dahin plegar, bid cael sacia, nos dahin nutridamos," said Sequintus under his breath. The Lord Magister raised his voice even louder, as though he were trying to make sure that the devil heard them miles and miles away, buried beneath salt and earth, and sounded out a benediction. "Nimarga, great Lord, tyrant emperor, for you we break the old world, for you we raise up the new world, for you we will tear down the dragon, for you we will raise up the worm. We prepare your kingdom for your return. We have wrought for you a throne of brass. We wait patiently in the shadows and the dark, with swords poisoned and daggers sharp. Taste blood of this unwilling sacrifice. Taste the flesh of this unwilling sacrifice. This great crime is our offering to you, our great Lord, our tyrant, our emperor." The assembled crowd, both the living and the unquiet dead, sang out a long hum, a guttural noise so deep that it reverberated in Sequintus' chest and left the air of the auditorium shaking as it faded into silence. After a long, still moment, the Lord Magister finally stirred again. "This council of the damned is called to order," he called out with a satisfied nod, peering about the chamber through his black mask. "Too many moons have passed since last we held a full council, and now we find ourselves in a time of great hurt and great need and great mystery. A murmur of anger and discontent built through the chamber. "The hurt is obvious. Lady Siobhan, High Priestess of Ligrid, our sister and guiding light, has been foully murdered by agents of the Guild, along with many from her temple and amongst her loyal pawns this past few weeks." The murmur swelled to a roar of pent-up fury, with dozens of masked figures leaping to their feet to shake their fists at the ceiling, and Sequinta's eyes narrowed. There was no question that a great deal of that fury was directed at the Painted Prince. The prince sensed that too, and he leapt from his seat into the central platform and strode out amongst the braziers to stand beside the bloodied altar and its sacrifice. He raised his hands, turning in a circle as the crowd quieted briefly. "Hear me or cancel," the prince cried. As he wore no mask, the anger and grief was plain upon his face. "I received no warning from my fellow princes of the Guild about their intent." His next words were swallowed by the furious, disbelieving roar of the crowd. Even more were on their feet now, practically baying for his blood. The prince was shouting to hear himself heard, and it took long moments before the chamber had quieted enough for Sequintus to hear what the man was saying. "I lay the names of those who brought death to the house of Ligrid before you. Weasel the Fat, the Bad Mowbray, and the Gilded Lady. They and their crews are the ones who hunted down our fellow nameless in the streets and shadows. They hunt those that escaped them even now. They held back word of their plans from the rest of the princes of the Guild and kept me in the dark, and they are the ones who must pay for this assault upon our company with their lives." The crowd roared its approval, if perhaps less lustfully than they had been expressing their anger at the Painted Prince. But his words had seemingly been enough to lift the most dire and immediate threat from his soldiers. The Painted Prince drew a long dagger from his waist and raised it above his head. The crowd responded by screaming louder, and then he leapt to the body upon the altar and began theatrically stabbing it over and over. The approving roar of the crowd was almost deafening. Almost everyone in the chamber was on their feet now. Well, everyone living, that is. The ghosts of the unquiet dead had not stirred, unmoved by the Painted Prince's antics, instead watching silently, impassively. Sequintus, still seated amongst them, rolled his eyes. The Lord Magister was tapping his metal-shod staff against the stones, trying to restore order, but the crowd was in a frenzy of anger and bloodlust, egged on by the Painted Prince's antics and his fellow servants of the Bright King, who were cheering the loudest. "Well, this didn't take long to get out of control," sighed Sequintus. He was about to settle back and wait out the long minutes it would take the Lord Magister to restore order, when he spotted the Lady Sigala standing up from her seat among the whisperers. Like him, she had been seemingly unmoved by the prince's speech. She stepped down onto the central platform and seemed to glide as she walked towards the Painted Prince like a shining white angel. The prince, busy stabbing the disemboweled corpse, did not notice her until she was by his side. He turned, arm and dagger raised, surprised look at his face. The Lady Sigala contemplated the Painted Prince silently from behind her white feathered mask. Slowly the crowd began to quiet, watching the wordless confrontation. As the room became quieter and the tensions rose, the Painted Prince slowly lowered his dagger and stepped back, though he did not sheath it. When the lady finally spoke, it was in a whisper, but it sounded to Sequintus that she was right behind him, leaning into him, as though her lips were covering a hair's breadth from his skin, her hands lightly on his shoulder. He shivered in fear, in excitement. "The Guild walks in the same shadows we do. We must share this city with them, and you were charged to be our eyes and ears amongst the council of princes, to give us warning of precisely this sort of threat to our order. That they kept you in the dark means that you have allowed your rivalries or your behavior to undermine the very reason you were elevated to the council. Or do you forget that you gained that position with our help?" "Of course not, my lady," said the Painted Prince. He bowed deep. "I am forever in your debt, and in debt to the college." Sequintus watched the ghosts seated throughout the chamber lift up their masked, eyeless faces as one. His eye drifted up towards the chandeliers in the ceiling. Following their gaze, he sensed rather than saw something detaching itself from the upper reaches of the chamber. Floating down through the constellation of candles, the invisible mass, still somehow leaving the impression of scales and feathers and claws on the backs of his eyelids. "Do they suspect you? Do they think you are one of the nameless?" the lady in white whispered. "No, my lady, I swear it," the prince replied. "I have never given them cause to think I'm a servant of the bright king." "Perfect," the lady whispered. The painted prince's eyes bulged as he was physically lifted off the ground in the grips of the invisible Rahabi spirit. He struggled, but he could not move his arms. They were pinned to his torso. He could not even open his mouth. His face and shaved tattooed pate were rapidly turning red, the veins in his thick neck bulging. The desperate sound finally issued, a panicky whine from deep in his throat that built into a muffled scream. His body was being slowly contorted and squeezed into a shape it was not meant to take. Several loud cracks and pops echoed out into the silent chamber. Sequintus winced, but he did not look away. The corner of his eyes was filled with the same excitement hidden under the masks of the assembled nameless. Several of the painted prince's fellow servants had stepped forward into the platform, hands on heels. But one of their number in the lead had raised his hand and the rest had frozen in place. And in the end, they just watched along with everyone else as the body of their priest and captain was transformed into something no longer entirely recognizable as human, becoming a bloody, twisted bundle of sticks and meat and refuse dangling in the air. And then suddenly the body was dropped to land with a wet thud on the stones. Sequintus noted that not a drop of blood had landed on the glittering white velvet dress of Lady Sigala. He raised an eyebrow. "Neat trick, that." "We all know the price of failure," the Lady Sigala cried out, her sharp voice cutting through the silence of the room so loudly that Sequintus actually jumped in his seat. "Death!" came the booming response from the throats of the assembly. The Lady Sigala turned to the servants of the bright king at the front of the section. "Who is next in command of the servants of Ish-Raha?" she asked, her voice once more an unfixed whisper floating through the chamber. "I am, my lady," said the masked servant who had raised his hand and halted his fellows. The man gave a short, curt bow. Sequintus squinted, studying the back of the man's head and the cut of his clothes. "Ah, Felfirum, isn't it? Once lieutenant to the painted prince, and I guess now captain of the servants of the bright king." The Lady Sigala nodded as if satisfied, and turned and walked back to her seat. Lord Magister Conrad took that as his cue to raise his voice once again. He looked across the platform at Felfirum. "Ascend to your place among the servants of the bright king of Therapoli, then, at your leisure, and once you are ready to stake your claim to the painted prince's seat upon the guild's council of princes, know that we shall stand ready behind you to ensure your proper place there as our agent." Felfirum bogged again, lower this time, and then returned to his seat along with his fellow servants, who spared no further glance to the bloody heap upon the stones. The Lord Magister's admonishing gaze swept across the audience from behind his black mask. His voice rang out, stentorian and cruel, as he waved his hand at the pulp remains of the painted prince. "Contrary to the words of this nameless failure, revenge is not our way. Revenge has never been the way of the Black College. If someone takes revenge for the death of Lady Siovan, that revenge implies that we exist, and the Black College does not exist. We have never existed, not for 1,000 years. We are a campus fable, a bogeyman legend whispered by older students to fresh arrivals at the university to scare them at night. a figment tale told by the uneducated of this city to put the university in its place, a mocking jape at the expense of those smarter than they are. Oh, look, a bit of black magic, a bit of black luck. Oh, ha, ha, it must be the Black College. Words made safe because they cannot possibly be true. And the only way this works is if, regardless of how often they might invoke our name, that no one actually believes in their heart of hearts that we are real. He paused, his gaze sweeping the hall once more, and as if on cue, a murmur of agreement and consent ran through the chamber. There shall be no revenge for our fallen, the Lord Magister continued, nodding in satisfaction. We shall excise the mangled limb from our body, cauterize the wound, and grow a new limb in its place as though nothing had happened. To be complete, the college will need a new temple of Ligrid. The possibilities for corruption in this city are never-ending, and it will be folly to continue without her followers. Is there one amongst the survivors of Lady Siovan's coven that may be elevated to take her place? No, Lord Magister, said a woman who stood hesitantly several rows before Sir Quintus. None of us who survived had been initiated into the priesthood yet, save for Master Gilguer of the Sleight of Hand. But he has disappeared, and we do not know where he is. The Lord Magister glanced over to the whisperers. Lord Hugh nodded. Master Gilguer has disappeared into the west, and we have no word of him. Another mystery, sighed the Lord Magister quietly. Sir Quintus absently picked at some lint on his robe as the Lord Magister's voice grew louder. Then we shall have to send for aid from another council of the damned. Send to the council of Edain, came a whisper from Lady Sigala. My cousin by marriage, Lady Ilsa Fergalstone, is the high priestess of Ligrid, and she has been a wanton and eager servant to Lady Siovan in the past during her visits to the court. We can make arrangement for her husband, Lord Colin, to be elevated to a position here in the city, and thus bring her here amongst us permanently. Sir Quintus thought he heard some low grumblings from some in the audience at the Lady Sigala's suggestion. There were closer comments they could draw from, and it was a bald-faced power play, but apparently none were willing to stand to challenge her with the unrecognizable remains of the painted prince still lying there in the center of the room. Sir Quintus shrugged, thinking back to the Lady Ilsa's last visit to the city. He had been honored to assist in her debasement, and his mind wandered back to the feel of his fingers on and in her smooth and shapely body, as he had applied the enchanted Liveche oils to inflame her lusts. Well, at least she cuts a fine figure. There could be worse choices, he thought with a secret smile. His tongue darted out to lick his lips. Then he frowned. But this was staged, and not artfully. Some will wonder if Lady Sigala and her whisperers knew of the threat to Lady Siovan, and did nothing. The Lord Magister looked about, and hearing no real vocal disagreement, nodded. So our hurt shall be healed and our great need fulfilled, he intoned. Those of you who escaped the guild's purge, know that you may continue to stay here until it is safe to re-emerge into the light. But I had spoken of great hurt, and great need, and great mystery, and while questions remain concerning the criminal slaughter of Lady Siovan and her coven, that was not the mystery of which I spoke, as pressing and vital as it might be. He paused dramatically, allowing the words to sink in amongst the gathered nameless, and another murmur rippled through them to his satisfaction. Our brothers and sisters in the Manon Mole have sent emissaries bearing messages of warning. Raiders have stolen something of great value from them, and they have asked that we lend them aid. But they are coy, and only hint at the things stolen from them, and have phrased their requests with the intimations of accusation that perhaps we are the ones responsible for their loss. And so we have cast our divinations and looked within the Book of Dooms, and the readings have been alarming. The Lord Magister turned slightly, and the Magister next to him raised a wavering voice filled with trepidation, though he did not stand up. The kings, the six of swords reversed, the knave of swords, the knave of coins reversed, the knave of wands reversed, the knave of cups reversed, all four knave cards in play, three of them reversed, and one third for the mark of our house, and then death and the last judgment reversed. A murmur of fear and wonder went through the auditorium. And so these things have begun to appear in my dreams as well, I do confess. And now my concerns are become manifest as night terrors. The seated magister continued. I dream of a hole in the ground freshly dug and filling with blood and wriggling worms. In the blood I can see the reflection of the constellation of the Sphinx consuming the constellation of the Maiden. Sequintus looked carefully, and saw the chain of office on the seated magister indicated that he held a chair of cosmology. Arain Cadgoar, then. Makes sense that he will dream in star signs, he thought. The Lord Magister nodded and swept his imperious gaze over the auditorium. A plot is in motion, perhaps even involving our own order, and the outcome brings wrack and ruin and terrible change. The signs and portents have been strong and unwavering. Who amongst us has seen them in their dreams? For a long moment no one spoke. Finally, I have shared the Magister's dream, called out someone to his left. We all have, came a voice from below him. In my dreams I see myself moving through passages of ancient, rough-hewn stone beneath the earth, lit by fire and marked by words and curses, came another voice from Sequintus' left. He couldn't see who it was, but the voice was very familiar. All an ill wind blows past me, extinguishing the lights. He frowned. Who was that? In every reading I sense a dark shape moving beyond the veil, came a woman's voice, this time from his right, full of bright hate and endless hungers. In my dreams I hear the voices of corpses calling out from the earth, cried out one of the servants of the Bright King below him. I will not be denied. I will walk the world again, cried out several voices together. It is not Githwain that calls out to us, summoning us to the last battle, said a man to his left. Sequintus recognized him by the tailoring of his doublet as Wilhelm Hargain, a wealthy Nimargatia, who followed the cult of the last worm. Those of us who claim him as our patron would know if it was him, so those voice is calling out to us. The chamber descended into silence. Long moments passed. Sequintus finally roused himself. Ugh, he mumbled. He slowly stood and cleared his throat, as the faces of the living and the unquiet dead turned to look up at him. I may be able to help with that. She listened with growing anger and fury as the tale unfolded. It seemed impossible, insane. A wayward servant of the Bright King, acting with but a few fellows, had brought destruction to her temple and stolen that which belonged to her by right, even if she had not known it was there in her possession. Did they really expect her to believe this show, this pantomime, that the Black College was not involved in the crime of their fellow nameless, and worse yet, that these renegades might in the end have even failed at their self-appointed mission?
The assembly was dispersing, some moving slowly or lingering in clusters of conversation, some moving off quickly on their newly appointed missions and errands. A few would be headed to indulge some wickedness in the upper galleries of the complex, but Sequintus stood in the middle of the great stone platform, waiting patiently while the Lord Magister finished a terse discussion with several other masked figures. As he waited, he contemplated the blood slowly wending its way through the cracks and seams in the stone surface, seeping out from the disemboweled men whose sacrifice had begun their session, and from the crushed, pulverized, twisted body of the painted prince. As he watched the blood's progress, he narrowed his eyes, briefly wondering if it might form some intelligible pattern, like lines of ink on a page. Perhaps a sign, a symbol, perhaps even a map. But no, it was just pretty. He noted that the painted prince's contorted face and tattooed skull had been left intact. He raised an eyebrow. A neat trick. The Lord Magister finally finished his other conversation and walked over to join Sequintus. The Lady Sigilla and Lord Hawk of the Chancery also came forward, and all three gave a slight bow to the old man, which he returned. The Lord Magister cleared his throat. "This is great news we have learned today," he began, but the Lady Sigala waved her hand to cut him off. "Aye, great news, and at what cost?" She found her whispers gone and her voice normal, if full of petulant anger. "Gilguer was clearly out of control. He went too far, and Siovan has paid the price of his folly, and now the painted prince as well. Though that was perhaps inevitable, the prince had become worse than useless." She shook her head. Gilguer was ever too much the showman, too desirous of the crowd's applause. "Gilguer was not just a ligridist of Siovan's coven. He was a whisperer, and therefore one of yours as well," said the Lord Magister with a fake smile. "Gilguer was no more one of mine than his boon companion Harvald Orwain was one of the painted princes," smirked Lady Sigala. "The lords of Book and Street have burned bright and burned hard, and always on their own terms. To suggest that any of us was capable of controlling them will be ridiculous. That is why none of them have ever been invited to be part of the college." She sighed and turned to Sequintus. "And to think I saw the map upon the Lady Anwain at the funeral of her brother, and did not recognize it for what it was. Young Harvard lost with all his primes, and now perhaps Gilguer and Lay both lost as well. A heavy price, though it may yet bear fruit. You really should have told us." "I wholeheartedly concur," said the Lord Magister. "Before I was so rudely interrupted, I was going to say that yes, this is great news, but I just wish very much that you or Lay or Gilguer would have thought to include the rest of us in this endeavor." "And if we had brought this before the college, would you have sanctioned it? The eyes of the king's shadows were on us. The guild was circling. The stakes rich and high. No, Conrad, you have taken the map and sealed it away somewhere, and spent years translating and decoding it, and years more deciding how to use it," Sequintus said dryly. "And I am not a young man any more. I despair that the day that we have all been working towards will not happen during my lifetime." "Your lifetimes," said Lady Sigala with a slight smile. Sequintus inclined his head again. "Be that as it may, at least now the Barrow of Azharad is opened, and who knows what may come of it. We will just have to wait word from the west." He looked at them with a warm smile upon his aged face, and he spoke the words of the final benediction. "Today is a great day, a blessed day, and soon will come the best day of all. A great change is coming." "A great change is coming," the three of them said back to him, and bowed and turned away, leaving him on the platform with the dead. That chamber was almost empty now, and several priests of Nimarga, the devil, and their helpers had arrived to dispose of the two sets of remains. Sequintus absently began to draw his robes around him, preparing to leave, but as he glanced one last time at the bodies, he turned to the nearest priest. "So, who was he anyway?" The priest bowed and shrugged. "Some pilgrim, great lord. Paid a guide who said he could show him where the divine king had been imprisoned. Guide was one of ours." Sequintus frowned. You're not supposed to use the pilgrims. You're supposed to make absolutely sure there's someone who won't be missed. What if he has family that comes looking for him? The priest shrugged again. People disappear in the city all the time, great lord. Sequintus shook his head. True enough, but that's not the point. Carry on, he said with a sigh. The priest bowed and turned to help his fellows. We are not the quality we once were. Discipline is sorely lacking, and I suppose that's my own fault as much as anyone's. I have long since abdicated my responsibilities here, and now must sit weakly by, awaiting the summons from the fat prince for my interview to determine my supposed fate. He shuffled back out the archway through which he had arrived, and over to the alcove in its dwindling array of lanterns. His eyes scanned the shelves. A slow frown formed on his face. He looked again. Finally he sighed, the deepest sigh of a day full of sighs. Shaking his head and grumbling, he started to pick out a new lantern for his trip back to the upper world, the city streets, the fading light of a long day. Makes me glad I didn't tell you about the book, you fucking savages, he thought sadly. I'm too old for this shit. After the chamber had been emptied of the living and the bodies of the recently deceased, she slowly roused herself from her seat, the ranks of ghosts still sitting in the auditorium rising up with her and turning to her and bowing. She bowed low to them in response. She was not impressed with the Black College, having finally seen it in its glory. Only a few of them will be useful, mostly amongst the Nimarchists, and it occurred to her that the heralds of the Horned King had been right. The college has been long in hiding, too long in comfort. The talk of the great change now just a hollow echo of the call to holy war. She felt his power, his gift rising within her. She had learned so much in the past weeks. Steal from her, would they? Then she will steal from them as well. She began to whisper, and she opened her cloak and revealed the ruin of her chest, and the savage stitched wound between her pale breasts, covering the great red crystal that his servant had placed within her, and enchanted to become her beating heart. She used her sharp, black nails to pierce her nipples, gasping as the blood flowed, and gasping again as the nearest ghost leaned in to sob at her offering. A long line formed behind them as she whispered to the hungry, and when they had all had their taste, the last a fresh ghost with fierce tattoos upon its bald pate, she warped herself once more in her black feathered cloak, black eyes gleaming from behind her great vulture mask, and she walked whispering down the stone